Yeah, I guess let's just get going and or wait, hang on. When are we supposed to start? 11:05 or 11? Let's see if anybody else's mic works. 11 a.m. sharp. So yeah, let's get going. So I think the high level thing here was I think a lot of folks are aware WebSQL has been on a long path towards deprecation and removal. If you look at the doc Victor linked to, I think he kind of gave a nice summary of the history of it, which is Firefox and Edge, the legacy Edge, never implemented WebSQL. Safari had an implementation, but removed it in Safari 13. And then Chrome has been basically, and Chromium-based browsers, including Edge, have been the only browsers to still have support. So I think the current state is M97. I think is when third-party context support is getting removed, and I guess we'll see what things shake out of that. And then I think there's a plan to remove it from non-third-party contexts after that. So what precipitated this conversation is the Edge team's been talking with different web properties about storage, and I think generally folks have columns around IndexedDB, like some properties of WebSQL want a WebSQL-like thing. I think there's been a lot of interesting ideas put forward for what replacements look like, and I think we just wanted to discuss, like, hey, where are we? Where are the timelines? Are we pulling one thing out without having a replacement? Is that the right path? And I think all this has been discussed a little bit on BlinkDev. So Jatinder, now that you're on, is there any other context you wanted to add or comments on the slide?
Yeah, sorry, folks. I just, for some reason, took forever to join. So thanks, Eric, for sharing some context. I think if you don't know me, I run product for Edge Web Platform team, partner fairly closely with Eric and other engineers on our team. And something I hear from time to time when I talk to customers, and it comes up relatively frequently, once every couple months, is they are considering building a PWA, but they realize that there's no SQL in the web. And so that's kind of a blocker for them. And I usually say, great, go use IndexedDB, use web storage, and it isn't a satisfying answer. I usually get it. That's not the problem I'm trying to solve. You're not listening to me type response. And so I think what we were hoping to do today is like just talk with folks. It's great to see Joshua and Victor here with us. I feel like a lot of folks have thought about this problem, but can we discuss, brainstorm together, how do we solve this customer need? And like, I think folks have known the history, but maybe I think we only have 2 slides here, and then it's really just a discussion. But the quick history over here is like, the WebSQL database standard was first proposed in April 2009, more than a decade ago. Chrome added support, Safari added support, and very quickly it was abandoned. And I think that I linked to a blog post here from the Mozilla team where main reason it was abandoned, there's no widely accepted standard for SQL. This in effect means take SQLite and reverse engineer it, which is can be problematic, especially if you're based on Rust and there's no SQLite implementation for you to use. I think this is something we've done in the platform before. Like Canvas feels like it has a vibe of, it was tech in WebKit that we later standardized. But that was the main reason why it was abandoned and Safari deprecated and Chrome deprecated. But if we look at the next slide, it's kind of interesting that, even a decade later, we're still seeing usage. And this is kind of surprising for something only implemented in Chromium browsers, was clearly said not supported quite early on. 1% of Chrome page loads even now have some WebSQL. So it makes me wonder, like, it seems like there's a mismatch. Maybe there's a customer need for this. There's a reason they're clinging on to this thing that is, for all other signals, has been told don't use. And HTTP archive is kind of interesting here, where I think that 2019 is when Safari dropped support, so maybe some library stopped using it, but there's still enough pages using it. So if we go to the next slide, I've heard this frequently enough where it felt like let's have this conversation, but it's usually in the context of I'm thinking about building a native app or a PWA, and I've evaluated and I have a lot of web assets and I could build a PWA, but I need SQLite. And the reason I often hear is customers' mobile app uses SQLite, their server uses SQLite, it's the database they're familiar with, it's the tool chain they use, and they just want to use that in the web. And then they discover it doesn't really exist. They find WebSQL frequently, but they also realize it's really out of date. It's a really old version of SQLite, doesn't have all the things that they really want. And as I mentioned, the IndexedDB conversation doesn't really land well because they're like, we want SQL, not an IndexedDB. You're asking me to rewrite, and that's not good enough for me. I have, I think Victor pointed me to some of these libraries, but like there is an absurd DB. Someone actually wrote SQLite on top of IDB. At least to me, it tells there's some demand here. Like someone would have gone through this effort. Doesn't feel like a practical solution for a lot of customers. They feel like I want native, not built on top of IndexedDB. I have shared SQLite compiled to WebAssembly as a solution. And so this does work for some customers. Like in some sense, it lets them control their destiny. The SQLite version, they control when they upgrade. But the feedback I also get is, it's yet another framework to consider. And we're often trying to minimize frameworks. If it's not natively in the web, maybe it's a signal. Why wasn't it natively in the web? There's also worries about payload side. And so that conversation usually goes to maybe the web isn't a good fit for me because it doesn't have this need. And I think the Chromium team has spent a lot of time thinking about new incubation ideas, storage foundation, augmented OPFS. So I think maybe we'd love to hear more from Joshua and Victor on these. But I've shared these with some customers, and I also get I just want SQLite. You're still not listening. You're getting me close, but not solving the problem I have. So I guess this is where we get to discussion. Like I think the topic here is just really there's a customer need and it feels like the web doesn't meet it. How do we solve this problem? And I'd love to pause here, maybe even give Joshua or Victor a chance to share their thoughts.
Yeah, I think we'll probably both dive in. So let's see. So in terms of IndexedDB, yeah, that is not an API that I would foist on anybody, especially somebody with any database or SQL background. One of the things that I think IndexedDB and even WebSQL has taught us is be cautious about building opinionated APIs. They're great for some things on the web, especially anything that involves permissions, because then you've got a much better idea of what the intent is, so you can reason about it. But for things like storage, I think what we've learned is let's just try and get out of the way and provide the lowest level capability that we can, which is what led us to the storage foundation and follow-on work from that, the origin private file system access handles. Bit of a mouthful. That really grew out of, okay, should we continue to maintain WebSQL, and what are the challenges with it? And Victor can speak in depth about the challenges of maintaining that. There's been lots of good stuff in the chat. I hope that gets captured in some way for posterity. Things like, what version of SQLite do we have to be bug compatible for all time? Is this a dialect of SQL that we standardize? And if so, okay, who's maintaining that and evolving that? And is that the same as the implementation? The WebSQL was, if you look back on the specs for it, it was, let's just do a JavaScript binding to this version of SQLite, done. There was no attempt to actually standardize the library. And we've been paying the costs since then of, as the SQLite evolves, having to turn off features, restrict features, have them maintain compatibility with the quirks that were exposed to the web. You mentioned security. That's also been a big issue. Victor has lost lots of sleep, probably brain cells, years off his life, dealing with security issues. And another reason for not wanting to have just a single implementation being exposed by all browsers. So anyway, all of that led us to thinking, okay, what's the future here? And we did have folks inside Google proposing, let's create a new relational database design for the web. And we looked at that and went, but developers often want, like, I want SQLite on the web. So saying, let's design a new relational database API for the web with its own query language is, again, not giving developers what they want, which is they've got native libraries that they want to use. So that led us to thinking, okay, what can we build? Is IndexedDB enough? Do we need another storage API? So we can actually let developers bring what they want to use to the web. And that led to the Storage Foundation work, which the two main use cases that we were thinking of for that were applications on the scale of things like Photoshop that needed to manage massive amounts of memory and have something equivalent to mmap for swap files, or applications that need very fast disk access from WebAssembly. So they can literally compile SQLite to the web, or to WebAssembly. And that's why we've spent the last several years building Storage Foundation and then getting feedback from other browser vendors about how to better integrate that with the file system API that we'd also designed. So I'll shut up now, but I'll pass the baton over to Victor briefly to talk more about some of the challenges of maintaining something like WebSQL.
Yes, thank you. And great chat question. I think this is essentially the conclusion that the document I wrote is coming to. But I think we started by talking about customer needs, right? From this perspective, I completely agree that, hey, we need to give people a way to run SQL. Not having SQL and not having relational databases means that at best people have to do all the work that the database engine would do by hand using the IndexedDB API. So I forgot the fancy word for saying this is cruel and unusual punishment, but something like that for developers, and maybe we get out of that space. I wrote in the document a bunch of problems that are particular to our current approach of take SQLite and run it as is in the renderer. Some of those problems are because I think when we put together WebSQL, we wanted to have a proof of concept as quickly as possible. So let's rush through, not worry about dialect and all that. Let's strap JavaScript to SQLite and see what happens. But there are a couple of problems that will show up no matter what we do. So the concurrency problem shows up even if, Alex, yes, it should be shared publicly, yes. So the concurrency problem shows up if we use SQLite. Even if we standardize a subset of SQL and then feed that into SQLite, there's still a problem where SQLite has one giant read-write lock, and you can essentially write from one transaction in one connection, or read from as many transactions as you want. And then when there's lock contention, SQLite degrades really ungracefully. Your code essentially stalls and retries, and then at some point there's an error busy that your statement fails with. So I claim this isn't the model we want to bring on the web. So if we're going to build a standard and say this is SQL for the web, there are a bunch of things in SQLite that we want to avoid. And I don't know if the answer is going to be, yeah, we're going to run SQLite in the browser process and make sure this is possible so we can work around these things, or no, it's actually not going to be SQLite. And heck, if we're going to standardize a subset of SQL, then it might be that in the time we do that, it's also enough time to find another SQL engine or write another SQL engine that's good for all the cases where you don't want to download a 1 megabyte module, compile it and run it and have your own thing. So this is for the ideal state of let's bring SQL to the web. On the flip side, a bunch of the folks we talked to are honestly like, they're not fully bought it on the web, right? They want to hedge their bets, and they have a code base, and through various ways, they run that code base on mobile and on web. On mobile, they have SQLite, which works, and they want to take their SQLite queries and run them on their web property. And this is very reasonable, right? If I was a tech lead on one of these projects, I would ask for exactly the same thing. Don't make me rewrite my code base for your runtime. Let me use what I have. So I think that even if SQLite isn't the perfect SQL for the future of the web, there's something to be said about the fact that SQLite is the most popular implementation of SQL. It's on every operating system I know. It's on every browser I know. So we need to give people some way to run SQLite. And SQLite has one name, but actually, if you look at the versions and if you look at the compile type options, there are billions of possible SQLite instantiations, and every significant code base I know tunes its SQLite for performance, for size, or for something else. So it might be that there is no SQLite that makes everyone happy. Hope this helps a bit, and I'll shut up in the interest of answering questions and being relevant to people.
Yeah, I didn't realize this is just a discussion between us five, but maybe we can take some questions from folks on chat. I don't know, Alex, if you had any thoughts to share as well.
I mean, I think, you know, we've all expressed the tension that that we've got, which is that a megabyte per, you know, plus compile time, you know, certainly on mobile devices, that puts us behind the eight ball. That does not leave us in a competitive place, but, you know, we are competitive at the high end on high end devices with high end applications, which is great, right? Like that's the best starting point you can possibly imagine, is to be in the game. And I think that's really a testament to all the work that everyone's done on Storage Foundation and WebAssembly and all the other pieces of tooling. And so we've got the escape hatch, right? So if you think about this as, we have the escape hatch, people can be self-service to the extent that they need to be in niches that can support it, but not all the time. How do we move from escape hatch only to, you know, well, but also that we you know, I think the other thing is that when we talk to customers, or Jatinder, Eric, when we've talked to customers internally, you know, we tell them, like, you know, WebSQL is still in the product. You can still use it. We haven't taken it away, and the usage is high enough that we probably can't. So, you know, we're going to still be here for a little while. So you can probably use it if you need to, and we'll give you fair warning if it's going away. But the warning has been enough to scare almost everyone away from it. So one of the things you could engineer is a change in the messaging. But I guess the question is, what we engineer that change in the messaging about? Are we going to say there is the blessed subset of the SQLite query syntax that you were talking about, Victor? Is it that we are going to, you know, come up with something new that has, I don't know, takes advantage of modern platform expressivity, like we reduce the chances of SQL injection by doing something like trusted types and tag template literals in a better way. You know, there's lots of options here that we could use to dress this up a little bit to remove some of this pain. So that's the conversation that we've been all having. Was there anything that I missed there, Eric?
I guess maybe we should talk about what is the planned removal time frame. I mentioned the M97 third-party context thing. I'd imagine we haven't yet found who's screwed by that. You know, maybe there's been some bugs I'm not aware of, but you know, I guess we'll see if that sticks. Is there a time frame planned for general removal? I see Victor raising his hand, so go ahead, Victor.
So my perspective is that as soon as we have a plausible replacement, which is, it's also what we did with AppCache. As soon as we had the library that we could tell people, hey, load this library and it will be fairly similar to AppCache, and use this until you're able to go to service workers. So as soon as we have something like that, I think we will kick off the WebSQL deprecation. And for folks who have seen the code base and who understand the testing situation, will hopefully understand that the problem is WebSQL looks like it's maintained, but it's really a best effort. Hey, we have to upgrade SQLite every time a new version comes out because it solves security vulnerabilities that they don't write about. So it's not an option. We have to upgrade. We can't keep our users exposed to all versions of SQLite. And if it happens to bring changes that break your WebSQL applications, I'm sorry, there is absolutely nothing I can do about it. I can't keep Chrome on an old version of SQLite. I can do minimal firefighting to try to keep things stable, but between the lack of test coverage and the fact that we have to keep SQLite upgraded, there's really not much we can do here. So current situation is very unsustainable, and I'd like to get out of that as quickly as possible. I think that this WebSQL replacement is going to be, sorry, Alex, take something like Absurd SQL, strap it on top of access handles for OPFS, and run that way. If this is too heavyweight for you, port to IndexedDB. Is this great? No, but at the same time, I think that the replacement that we're talking about will take maybe 5 years to build. I may be overly pessimistic here, but I think that a maintainable version of this is about 5 years out. And I don't think it's responsible to tell developers, keep using WebSQL for the next 5 years, given that we can't maintain it.
Have you also looked at taking the query optimizer bits off of the top of WebSQL or SQLite and throwing them against like an IDB backend? Because it seems that the problem here is that everyone has to pull all their data for all their indexes into memory before they can start to do a join, which is what really tanks everything right now with IDB solutions.
So the problem from my perspective is that different people like different parts of WebSQL. Some people like the fact that it has a full text search engine. Some people like the fact that there are all these complicated queries that they run. Some people just run very simple queries and like the fact that it's all fast and good and doesn't have IndexedDB's performance cliffs. And part of that is because of our implementation. Part of it is because SQLite is solid evolving and all of that. So we have looked at, hey, what would it take to take a query plan and build a query plan API into IndexedDB where you can access index directly and all of that. It would solve part of the problems, but this would be the approach where we essentially try to say, no, IndexedDB is not a lost cause. We're going to keep improving it and keep improving it and keep improving it. And there's a lot of merit to that, especially for apps that have already made the jump to IndexedDB. Making IndexedDB better is beneficial for the web. On the flip side, it will never be a SQL database. So it's never going to be the answer to, I have SQL, maybe I'm willing to write my own parser, or maybe I'm willing to bring in some minimal amount of userland libraries, and I want to run SQL. I want a proper relational database with proper indices, proper joins, and all of that.
Yeah, and when we've talked to, again, I mentioned an effort at some point for some Googlers who wanted to design a new relational database for the web. And we were asking, okay, how much of this can you do in userland? What do you need fundamentally? Like, what could we add to IndexedDB to provide this? And they're like, direct file access, a B tree. They didn't want any of IndexedDB in the way. IndexedDB is, it's a key value store that has built-in versioning and transactions. And from their perspective, none of that was useful. And in fact, would get in the way. So again, we sort of bottom out in something like storage foundation.
Victor and Josh, to what extent, I'm hearing that your primary concern—
I think we're almost out of time.
Sorry. I was just going to ask—
Go for it, correct. I'd like to hear your point of view.
I was just going to ask Victor and Josh, it sounds like your primary concern is about the maintainability. Like, I know there's other concerns. I'm concerned about interoperability with other browser vendors and whatnot. But say, for example, someone else in the Chromium community outside of your team stood up and said they were willing to take on the maintenance burden of SQLite in Chromium. Would you be okay with it staying in Chromium at that point?
So I think it's not the maintenance burden in the sense that, oh, our team is not staffed to maintain this. We are reasonably well staffed to maintain storage on the web, I think. And if not, I feel empowered to make sure we are. I think the problem is having a solution. So I want someone to come to me and tell me, here is how I'm going to be able to keep SQLite upgraded and yet keep WebSQL stable. And then if you can tell me how you're going to be able to write tests for all the cases of that SQLite covers, I will be very impressed. SQLite says that it has millions of lines of tests, so I would be very, very impressed to see a plan that says this is how we're going to build an equivalent of that in web platform tests to make sure that our code remains.
And introduce a versioning plan so that new features of SQLite can be incorporated. Things like the full text search, there are big requests from users, and there's like 5 different versions in the SQLite code base.
Yeah,
so this is like, we don't think we could get away with, like you were saying earlier, we upgrade SQLite and we say, sorry, like if it breaks your web app, there's nothing we can do. You don't think that's, like, so what? Like, what if we just left it that way? You know, isn't that similar to the mobile ecosystem, right? When someone uses a new version of Android, it has a new version of SQLite on it, it might break their Android apps.
Android, yes. So there are security vulnerabilities in Android if you know how to tickle things the right way, and you can own every application that happens to expose a content provider, so on and so forth. I think we had some fire drills around that. The problem is that in Chrome, we make certain promises to users, right? And as far as I know, it's not acceptable to tell the security team, yes, there is an RC in SQLite. We're not going to do anything about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely, we have to upgrade. But how do we have to hold the same high bar for web compatibility in SQLite as we do in other places?
Yeah. I mean, there's a model where we treat it like a device. It's a black box. You know, you don't know when you're using the shape recognition API to do barcode detection. Yeah, it might work, might not. I personally don't feel good about that for a storage API where you're expecting users can actually write important data and have it be there the next time they're using your browser.
If I would be the TL of a product using this, I would decide to build my parallel version of WebSQL if this is the support level I got.
And I bet you lots of Android apps do. Has anyone done the survey to find out of native mobile apps, Android and iOS, what fraction of them include their own SQL engine versus using the OS's built-in SQL engine? This is a common thing I've heard from developers all the time. Hey, I build my app for multiple platforms, and every platform I ship on comes with a SQL engine except the web. What the heck, web? Like, maybe we can test that? Like, is it all these small dinky apps that are important that are using like the system SQL database, but then like serious database apps on the mobile platforms are shipping their own? Do we know?
I think this is a thing where if it mattered, we could go and find out and then figure out a way to share this information responsibly.
Yeah. So by the way, thank you for this discussion. I think, Victor, I liked when you said we won't deprecate WebSQL till we find an appropriate alternative. And so it was like, great, no customer's going to be unhappy until you mentioned IDB as an alternative. And it's like, I'm not sure that will solve customers' problems. Like what I hear from customers is like, you're not listening. And I think this is a hard problem, very complex, but I think we need to think a little bit about, should there be a WebSQL 2? Is it just an update? Is it a different database? How do we solve this? I actually like the idea of if we can pull in some customers into the conversation. And so it sounds like it sounds like I'm hearing openness from the Chrome team to discuss this further and not rush to just deprecate WebSQL.
Yes, so please see what I wrote as, hey, we were willing to spend the time to just get everyone else up to speed because we want to hear thoughts, opinions, alternatives. So far, I think we haven't considered the alternative of we're going to have a SQL engine that may change. So far, this is my bias. I thought, yes, the engine has to be stable. A query that runs in a certain way today has to run in the same way in 10 Chrome versions from now. If this is no longer true, maybe that opens up extra avenues. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for attending. I think we can chat more async. So thanks.